I know I'm a stickler when it comes to sticking on time. So unless I'm talking.
I'll start sharing now.
You may start sharing. And you just have to unmute yourself, David.
Okay.
And
Everybody
George,
sees that?
George, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is a record turnout. Right now, we had over 200 people sign up for this. Just goes to show you there is such a thing as a free meal. I believe that we are trying to our best, CPES, my partner and myself, Phil Brilliant, are trying our best to make sure that we have meaningful presentations, sometimes not even for credit. And we're going to continue this chat scenario one every month. And we got some really great stuff lined up for you. So please keep posted as to what we're doing. We have over 222 people, I think, signed up for this. And therefore, we have an indication that this is something that is welcome and needed. I want to thank our presenters today. First of all, and I really appreciate the department's willingness to participate in this. David Haymes, who's somebody I've had a really had relationships with Dave for years at DEP, and I've always appreciated the opportunity to work with him. Rafael Rivera is with us as well. And I again appreciate the time that the department is devoting to this. This is an important subject. Andy Robbins is sitting there waiting for somebody to say something wrong, and he's going to pounce. And he is the guy who invented the term PRCR. So you can talk to him about that later. We got a listserv, or actually we got a modification of a rule relative to extending timeframes. And as such, I found it somewhat confusing, if not totally confusing, but then that's me. I didn't score well on my verbals at the SAT scores. But at any rate, I thought it'd be really instructive to have somebody who knows what they're talking about to explain to us how the extensions are going to work. There's so many permutations of these extensions based on individual circumstance. I do believe, quite frankly, that even the department isn't sure how this works. And I think that's evidenced by at least 3 clarifications that have come out already. And I didn't check my email yesterday to see if a 4th came out. But at any rate, I think we're all working this thing through together. And I am glad that we're going to hear from the people who know the most about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David with a big thank you, and Rafael with a big thank you. And Dave's all yours.
Thank you. So again, I think I said, resume the slideshow. So again, I'm David Haymes. I'm a director in the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program. Rafael is a section chief in the Bureau of Case Assignment and Initial Notice. Most of the time frame questions go to Rafael and the staff that work for him in BCANE. So moving on to the slide. Again, this was the 3rd rule relaxation we've done since Governor Murphy signed EO 103 on, I always get the date wrong, it's either March 8th or March 9th in 2020 for the public health emergency due to COVID. And first there was a 90-day extension and COVID kept going, or the emergency kept going. So we added another 180 days and took that out to 270. We reached that 270 deadline. There didn't appear to be any end in sight to the pandemic and the public health emergency. So, talking with upper management in the governor's office, we took it out to 455 days, starting back on the March 8th, March 9th deadline, date from 2020. So a March 2020 case is going to be coming due after that 455 days is going to run through this June. But a case that started yesterday gets their regular timeframes plus the 455. So it would be, just making up a number, 6.5 years from now. For, a case starting today would have an RI due in 6.5 years, as opposed to the 5 years. So again, the notice of the rule waiver modification and suspension is on our website. You can find it through the listserv archive, or on the main webpage. It's on the right-hand side under what's new. For this rule relaxation, we did add a provision that you need to have an LSRP retained by March 18th of 2021. That would have been 45 days after the notice was signed on February 1st. And that's for existing cases, and for new cases and other cases moving forward, you have to follow the rule pursuant to ARCS at 2.3. And again, that's within 45 days of the trigger, or within 45 days of if you have a retained LSRP who resigns or is dismissed, you would have to have another LSRP brought in. So the extensions are broken down into two categories. Those cases that are subject or were subject to the statutory time frame to complete the remedial investigation by May 2014 or May 2016, and those cases that were not subject to the statutory time frame. Those that are subject to the statutory time frame get 1 year. So I go into this a little more, a May 2021 timeframe would become a May 2022 timeframe. For all of the non-subject cases, they get 455 days. So like I said, a case that was due last March of 2020 would now be due June of 2021. And just one of the clarifications that we came out with is if a regulatory time frame was moved up. So there's a 2-year gap between the regulatory time frame and the mandatory time frame. Most extension, I shouldn't say most. I assume most extension requests that come in are going to say, hey, you know what? Give me the full 2 years. I want to extend my regulatory up to my mandatory. Some people didn't do that. They only asked for 1 year on the regulatory. So again, there's more on this later, but I always explain it this way. So you had your 2 years in between, you brought your regulatory up, those timeframes now travel together. So when you move this 1 year, you move your mandatory 1 year as well. You're not going to move your regulatory and then reset 2 years on your mandatory. Mandatory and the regulatory just continuously move together now. Okay. So this was the first clarification that we ordered up, and I saw his name. I'm going to throw him under the bus. We have Bill Hose to thank for this. When we were working on and I'll throw myself under the bus for it. When we were working on this extension, it completely slipped my mind that the May 2014 soil cases were given by regulation a later time frame than they should have been, and that was because we couldn't get the rule adoption done in time. So the time frame that would have applied to these cases had already run before we had the rule out there. So what we did when the rule came out in 2018, we gave these cases 6 months to meet their regulatory timeframe, which pushed them to February 6th of 2019. And you can find that in the tech regs in subchapter 5 at 5.8B1. So those were left out of this rule waiver. So what we did is we put out a listserv and we basically said, if you can get us an extension by May 1 of 2021, if you have one of these cases, and you request an extension, we will extend the mandatory time frame 1 year to February 6, 2022. It's basically a no questions asked, just send us that request and we'll give it to you. The regulatory time frame passed before EO 103 was signed, so that was a done deal if you hadn't extended on the regulatory time frame yet. So it was just the mandatory time frame that could still fall within EO 103. It was after March of 2020. And that listserv can be found at this address here. This is kind of down at the bottom of this slide, mainly because I ran out of space on other slides. The waiver does not cover expedited site-specific timeframes. And I'll repeat this one bullet again at the end of my talk. So getting into the meat of it, the big issue that was coming up was the May 2021 statutory case deadline. And depending on the type of case you had, if it was soil only, and you had gotten the extension to May of 2016, that would have been a mandatory time frame coming due this year. For groundwater cases from 2014, it would be a mandatory extension. And for groundwater cases that had the 2016 statutory extension, and again, these are all bulleted out as we go. those would have had a regulatory May 21 for the remedial action. So 2014 statutory universe, soil and impacted media. They would have had a May 2019 RA regulatory timeframe. They did not ask for an extension. So that timeframe came and went prior to March 2020. So there's no extension given for that. If the RA wasn't sent in, you're out of compliance on that. But that's an enforcement issue. Separate from that, even though you didn't meet your regulatory deadline, you did not request an extension, you still have that 2 years until the mandatory timeframe. And again, the issue for the mandatory timeframe is when you miss that, that's where direct oversight would kick in. So between regulatory and mandatory, that 2 year is a compliance issue for enforcement, penalties, things like that. When you miss the mandatory, that's when you need to start worrying about direct oversight implications. So the mandatory for the RA would have been May 6, 2021, coming up in 2 months. Yeah, 2 months. And because that falls after May 20, that is subject to this rule waiver, that gets kicked out 1 year to May 6, 2022. So again, it's a statutory case. All of those get the 1 year on the applicable timeframe. There's nothing to say you cannot request an extension, but what we're saying is your new timeframe is May 2022. So 60 days prior to May 6, 2022, and no more than 6 months prior to May 6, 2022, you could submit an extension request pursuant to ARCS. And again, Rafael and his group down in B Kane will evaluate that extension request, and you could potentially push it out even farther than May 2022. Okay, Phil and George, do you want to do questions on each of these as I go through, or just save that for the end? I'm good either way.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I would just keep going.
Okay. So moving on to the next situation would be the same type of case. It's a May 2014 statutory case that received a 1 year extension on the regulatory timeframe. So that pushes it to May 2020. They are not, that regulatory timeframe is now subject to the rule extension because it is after March of 2020. So per the rule waiver, that regulatory timeframe gets pushed out to May of 21, and the mandatory timeframe gets pushed out to May of 22. The mandatory timeframe would have been May of 21, right? 2 years after May of 19. So each of those gets 1 year. So 19 and 21 became 20 and 21, became 21 and 22. Again, in May, well, I guess it would have to be by Saturday. Saturday is March 6th, is your 60 days. Again, you can extend, or I'm sorry, this one only needs 30 days. So April 6th this year, you can push that regulatory out to the mandatory. You couldn't push it any far. You can never push a regulatory beyond a mandatory. Next year in May of 22, if you see you're still going to be bumping up on your time frame, that's where, again, 60 days prior, you can ask for an extension to the mandatory time frame. So the last scenario for the May 14 cases would be a regulatory of May of 19 that got the full 2 year extension. So the regulatory and the mandatory are now the same date. They're both May of 21. So now you're like this. Both of those dates travel together 1 year to May of 22. You no longer have two separate timeframes. In March of 22, you have your 60-day limit. You can ask for an extension to that singular mandatory timeframe that's out there now. And again, we ask that you not submit that any sooner than 6 months prior, which I believe is November. I'm really bad at calendars, so I apologize in advance if I start to get my months mixed up.
So David, just remember your anniversary. But there is a question, if you don't mind taking it.
Yep.
It's right on what you're talking about right now. If there is a remedial investigation or remedial action timeframe specified in an ACO, i.e. adjusted direct
Yep.
oversight.
I'll get to that. The ACOs are my last slide.
Okay, we'll hold off that one. And the other one is, if the DEP, if the past DEP denied an extension, if an RI deadline was missed, can you explain if the mandatory timeframe extension will be granted?
No, I cannot, because again, it's going to be all case specific. The easy answer for me to give on the regulatory denial is it was not submitted timely. Once you miss that time frame of 30 days, it's an act of God to get an extension from us on the regulatory side.
Right.
I'm not saying that was the scenario, but again, if that were the situation and technically it's justified, so it was on the administrative side that we didn't extend it, I would say, absolutely submit that. And then Rafael's group will look at the technical aspects and say, yes, thumb up, thumb down on the mandatory part.
So I'm just going to clarify and take one. So just to make sure, because you and I talked about this last week and you clarified it for me. The only stipulation in this waiver is that an LSRP must be retained. So if a previous deadline was missed, you're okay as long as an LSRP is retained.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I thought you meant if somebody submitted an extension request.
Yeah.
Irrespective, as long as you have not blown the mandatory time frame already. Let me rephrase that. As long as you didn't blow the mandatory time frame prior to May of 2020, March of 2020, excuse me, you are eligible for this rule waiver extension. If you had a mandatory time frame of February of 2020, that does not get extended by this. But as long as you had a date that came in after, you should be okay.
Why don't you continue with your slides? I'll hold the other two.
Okay.
Yep.
So moving on to the next one. Now we're going to do hold on. There. Did that move on to the May 2016?
Yes.
Okay. So again, it's the same three possible scenarios. It's a remediation that applied for, received, and maintained the statutory extension for the remedial investigation from May 2014 to May 2016. They did not ask for or get an extension, a regulatory extension to the remedial action. Again, the RI extension was a given through the statute. So now they completed the RI, they've moved on to the RA, and they did not request an extension on that. The remedial action, so and again, this is, I'm sorry, soil and impacted media. So they got 5 years. So May 16 RI becomes a May 21 regular media. They did not ask for an extension. So that regulatorily, their regulatory time frame for the RA is this May. That has now been pushed out to May of 22. Again, I do my hand thing. So our regulatory 21, mandatory 23, that was that first bullet, which I skipped, sorry about that. So moving to the third bullet, per the waiver, the new remedial action mandatory time frame will be May of 24. So again, it was 21 and 23, they're 2 years apart. They travel together 2 years apart. They're now 22 and 24. And again, in terms of the May 22 regulatory time frame, 30 days ahead of time, you can come in April and request an extension to that regulatory time frame, whether you ask for a day or the full 2 years out to May of 2024. Okay. Come on. Second scenario, again, it's the May 2016 universe, regulatory time frame on the RA. They do request a 1 year extension. And again, you can request any extension on that regulatory you want. We just used 1 year to keep the numbers even, that kind of thing. So again, the remedial action regulatory time frame was still May of 22. That is now pushed out to May of 23. And again, the mandatory time frame was May 22. I'm sorry, May 23. And again, that gets pushed out to May 24. So you had 2 years. You moved it up 1 year on the regulatory. Those now travel together as 1 year, May of 22, May of 20, or I'm sorry, May of 23, May of 24. Okay. And same thing again, you can ask 30 days ahead of time for an extension on that regulatory because you didn't push it all the way out yet. Last scenario is you did push the regulatory all the way out to the mandatory. So again, now you just have a single time frame. Everything travels based on that mandatory time frame of May 23. So those would both push out 1 year to May 24. And because it's only a mandatory that you're dealing with 60 days ahead of time, so March of 24, you would have to send in that, no later than March 24, you would have to send in the request asking to extend the mandatory time frame. For the non-statutory cases, the timeframes for all the submittals that are listed in the EO, and I printed that off here. So it's the 2.5 pages of timeframes that are spelled out there that are out of the regulations. All of those get 455 days, whether you're an ISRA case working on your PA, you're an ISRA or US case working on your SI, or you're any kind of case and you're working on your RI or your RA. I'll be honest, it's been a while since I looked at the list. Whether this, I would have to look at it closely. Whether this also covers your LNAPL, I'm just not remembering. I'm sorry about that. What I can tell you is that IEC timeframes are not subject to the extension. You know, again, that is our highest priority. We need to be protecting the receptors. Your takeaway from this should be to remember IEC situations are not part of the extension. You know, again, I'd have to go through it one line at a time to check on other things like the receptor evaluation and the LNAPL reports. So again, on the next slide, and this is like a back and forth thing. So the next slide actually shows a page out of Data Miner. So this slide here goes with those timeframes and that are on the next slide. So hypothetically, you had a site investigation that was due March 10th of 2020. So it was the day after the EO got signed. The new date for that site investigation will be this year, June 8th, 2021. So it's March 10th plus 455 days. If it's soil only, the remedial investigation would be due June 8th of 24 and the RA in June of 27. If it's soil plus an impacted media, again, you get 2 more years on that per just how the rule is written in general. So it would be June 8th, 26 and June 7th of 31. And it scares me to say something is due in June of 31 because I think I will be retired by then. So again, this is what Data Miner looks like today. Updates have not occurred yet. So if you look down at can you see my mouse on the screen when I move it around?
Yep.
Okay. So down here is that due date that we were talking about, and this is where things need to start getting pushed out. So here, well, this one was already received. And this is actually another question. I don't think I have it as a slide here, but we met about this earlier this week, and this came up last week, either at one of the 2 talks I gave. Even if you submitted a report timely, and I'm going to probably word it how Mark doesn't want me to, but I'm going to word it this way on purpose. You will not be penalized for submitting a report timely. So if you had a due date of April of 20 for your RI, so that would be within the EO. You got that report to us in January of 20, you gained 3 months on your RA, but your RI was still due, what did I say, April? April of 20. You get the 2 years, you would get the 455 days still on your RA. So your RA isn't due until April of 25, you would get April of 25 plus 455 days. So July of 26. Okay. And again, that's not on one of these. That is how we are going to be moving forward on these cases. So my last slide is about ACOs and extensions for timeframes that are established in an administrative consent order will mirror the type of case they are. So if it's an ACO that was written for a case that is not subject, the timeframes in the, I'm sorry, not subject to the statutory requirements for 2014, 2016, those cases will get 455 days added to the date in the ACO, as long as that date is between March 9th of 2020 and whenever the EO ends. But again, if it's a time frame set for the RI, it carries through all subsequent timeframes. You would still get the 455, even if it's well beyond the end date of the EO, you still get that addition onto your RA. For cases that were subject to the May 2014, May 2016, 20 statutory requirement on the RI, you would get 1 year. Okay, and I believe, oh, and then again, I just, because I said it at the beginning, but I didn't want to forget it again, as somebody had asked, site-specific, expedited site-specific timeframes are not covered by the rule waiver. Again, the whole idea is we're expediting it for a reason. It may be having an immediate impact upon a receptor. We need to get that remediation completed. And I believe that is it. And so if there are more questions, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let Rafael handle all the questions.
Okay, good. So George, before you head in with Andy, just a couple of questions I want to take off the questions that came in. One is, can David repeat his statement about submitting remediation reports timely for timeframes? I still get the additional 455 days on my next remediation report.
Correct. As long as the report that was submitted timely was due, the due date was during EO 103. If you had a due date of December of 2019, you're outside of the EO. Your actual due date had to be after, it's either, and I can never keep it straight, it's either March 8th or March 9th. I think I have it written down, actually.
I think Andy put it in the
March 9th. So as long as your due date was March 9th or later, even if you got it to us in February, you're still subject to the extension.
and the dates run off of when remediation was initiated,
Correct.
not when you submitted reports.
Correct. So when you submit your RI, that does not reset your RA date.
Correct. Okay.
Phil, I'm sorry, Rafael's got some stuff to add. He's asking to be unmuted. Sorry.
He can unmute himself.
Okay.
Maybe not.
Rafael, you good?
You're live.
All right, yes, the host had it unmuted. Go back to the slide from data miner. So I think the easiest way to kind of determine if you fall within the EO is if you go to the case tracking tool, and if you go under the due date right here, if your date is between March 9th and today, for example, it's the end of today, then any of those dates between March 9th, 2020 and today will be adjusted, and an additional 455 days will be added to those due dates, regardless if the report was received or not. So that's what the example that David just went over right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to readjust all these dates here and add 455 days to that date. So for example, this case here for the IRE, they missed the regulatory time frame because they came in late. However, when we add the additional 455 days, they're going to be in compliance with the regulatory time frame. So I mean, that's the easiest way to try to figure that out. Go to the case tracking tool, look at the due dates, anything between March 9th and whenever the EO ends, let's say ended today, we're going to make those adjustments and pick them out for the non-statutory cases.
Phil, if I could just jump in for a second, Rafael, just on that one point, and there are a couple others that it's probably going to be good to review again.
Yeah.
When you said today, you mean whenever
Yeah, the EO, I just use that as an example, the end of today.
So if the executive order is officially declared ended July 31st, it's 455 days for anything that falls between the beginning of the EO and July 31st in that
Correct.
example.
Correct, you got it.
So it's rolling for now, and eventually it will stop. Are you going to update data miner before it stops or sometime after it stops?
Well, we're hoping to update it. Hopefully, there's no guarantee. We're hoping by the end of the month or April. I mean, obviously, we have to update this soon because the June date is coming up for those worst case scenario that would do March 9th. They do have a due date coming up June. So we're not sure if it's going to be extended beyond that. So we want to make sure they don't get penalized for not submitting the extension request in time.
And in the task bar, are you going to have a separate item saying extended by EO, or are you just going to change it at, the way it's listed now?
Well, it's going to look the same way. It's just going to be adjusted. We're going to be putting probably a comment in our database to reflect that why the change was made. But that's, unfortunately, you guys don't get to see that. But, the way to calculate it too is if you look at your day remediation required to be initiated, most of them, like the IRE, PASIs, usually do 1 year or 2 years. If you see that a date, it's not a 1 or 2 year, it's something different, 3, 4 years, it could be either extension or it fell within the EO. I mean, that's something we can think about if we want to add something additional in there to this way people realize that it got changed because of the EO. That's something that we would have to consider doing the data load.
The problem we have is the problem that I see in my head, Andy, is we have so many reports written and they're based on behind the scenes. What is remedial action report do called behind the scenes to now create a new date field? We'd have to update every single line in every single report to recognize what's that new language used.
Right.
So instead, Rafael, maybe what we do is we add a task that just says dates updated by EO.
Right.
And we can list that out in the report as just a standalone task,
Yeah.
irrespective of the date it happened, just the fact that it happened.
Right.
And
Right.
See if
Like-
we can do it that way.
Like you have phone call or other aspects.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep,
Yeah.
you got it. Yep, that's something that's doable.
Hey, George, just let me run through a few more questions and then, because we're good on time here. So if an extension request was made to extend the the regulatory timeframe by 6 months prior to EO 103, so that the remediation timeframe is now November 6th of 2021, does the EO 103 add the timeframe to this new extended timeframe?
I mean, that's basically what I just went over. If you
Yeah.
go on case tracking tool and your due date is after March 9th, 2020, I'd rather not get into the different scenarios. That's the easiest way to determine whether you get the 455.
So you really need to
Just
pay
go-
attention.
Right, just go in, the case tracking tool, go in your due date. If you see any due dates that are between March 9th, 2020, and whenever the EO ends, you get the 455. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it.
David, off the top of your head, very clear that IECs, there is no extensions of any timeframes. How about vapor concerns? Same bucket?
I believe vapor concerns would be outside the bucket. But don't quote me on that 100%. That's one I'll follow up on.
Okay.
But again, it's, a vapor concern is just that. It's a concern. It's not an immediate environmental concern. That the IEC is, you've got to keep those windows open and have the people outside of the house, versus the vapor concern. Again, those have extended timeframes within the rule, but better safe than sorry. The answer for me would be to say no, they are not, but I will go back and check on that.
And
I'll
one
get the
apple,
word to you and George and let you know.
and one apple is the same scenario. That same question is, will an apple timeframes like IECs, or are they extended?
So actually, I'm taking my time while you guys are talking. LNAPL is covered That's in the tech regs at 1.10C. And that is one of the time frame that gets extended. The initial receptor is extended. But I am not seeing concern extended.
Okay.
Hmm.
David,
That's why, yeah, just to add, most of those that are in the EO, can't guarantee it again. Like Dave said, we have to check them. But most of those are usually tracked in the case tracking tool if they apply to your site. That's why I say use the case tracking tool, because we pull out all those that have associated timeframes. So if this case had LNAPL, you'll most likely see the LNAPL task in there. So that's a one way to tell too.
David, this is one you and I have talked about. If you submitted an extension last summer and it is not showed up in data miner yet, should you contact DEP to confirm status? So take that one step further. Is DEP even going to look at it if it hasn't been looked at?
Right, if it falls within the EO, the listserv was specific and said we will not review those that fall within the EO. So I'm assuming that one didn't fall within the EO. Or I'm sorry, fell within the EO and that's why it wasn't processed. So it could be that scenario.
Phil, can I jump in a second?
Yes.
And by the way, a lot of the questions I have already been asked, and I think it's particularly relative to vapor issues, I think is really important. But I also want to know, quite frankly, heretofore, we used to be somewhat laissez-faire on regulatory timeframe requests and how they're recorded. It seems to me now that's changed. It seems to me that there's going to be launch dates that are going to be linked to regulatory timeframes. And I think that it's really more important for us to make sure that in our comprehensive LSRP reports that we have correct information in there. And I was wondering, David and Rafael, do you share that perception?
Yes, I mean, we should have correct information in there all along. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say our data are perfect. I've been there long enough. I've worked with NGEMs enough to know. But I want to share the blame on that. It's a two-way street. We've been, speaking to it for the last 10 years since we went to the LSRP program, how important timeframes are, that we can only, we've got 10,000 cases with 4 to 10 dates each. Right. And we try to keep track as best we can. But as an LSRP or the PRCR, if you go in there and you see a date is wrong, tell us. We can't fix it if we don't know it's broken. So, this is just another example of where it's kind of going to bring things to a head. Right. But, the more we can get these dates correct, the sooner we can get these dates correct, the easier that path forward for everybody is, at least in terms of knowing when something is going to be due.
Yeah, it's always been my impression that the regulatory timeframes have almost been self-implementing, and you shouldn't stand by the phone waiting to hear from DEP. Seems to me correct. That's a game changer.
It's still, the way the rule is written is as long as you submit that thing within the request 30 days or more ahead, it's just a given. You get it approved. We will not be approving regulatory extensions in the future. Again, it's still, we just look at it for timeliness.
Well, and also previous compliance, that could be an issue.
Right.
If they missed a previous regulatory timeframe or mandatory, whatever it may be, that could be grounds for denial too. So
just we've been talking about extensions of timeframes. If you submitted for a lengthening request prior to the issuance of the EO, do you need to withdraw that, or will you get that same EO 103 timeframe extension?
I'm not gonna go into that right now. I mean, that's an issue we recently discussed, and we're currently evaluating that at this moment. I think what we're going to do, and I hate to do this, but I think if it's within the EO, most likely what will happen is we're going to process and give them the additional time. So we're gonna give them the additional 455, assuming that they fall within DEO, and then process the lengthening.
Will we see a listserv on that, Rafael?
Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe not. Yeah.
If we've submitted a lengthening, is it something we should question? Or are you going to address it to those specific people?
Right now, we're evaluating. I really don't want to get into a lot of details because,
Okay.
This is an issue that we, to be honest, we just discussed yesterday.
Okay.
So that is, it depends on the timing, when it was received, does it fall within DEO? Now, if it's a future date, if your RI, for example, is due in June of 2020, and you submit a lengthening, you're not within DEO right now. So we would process it. So the issue is if you're currently under the DEO and you submit a lengthening, it could potentially kick you out. So that's the issue we're dealing with right now.
Okay. So more to come on that.
Right.
Trying to find not some of the duplicates.
But again, like I said earlier, if your due date currently is between DEO, if you go in the case tracking tool, our intent was to change those dates. So that's all. That's where it's kind of it's all about timing when the system gets updated.
David, and Rafael, I know that you are saying that the various extensions that are presently applicable to the information that's in NGEMS now is going to be automatic. I don't find that terribly comforting. I'm wondering, and I think I know what the answer is, please don't. I'm wondering if we should send in requests irrespective, even though you're telling me it's going to be automatic, in terms of making sure that data miner is accurate in terms of the dates.
Please don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent these forms that are just going to sit there and we're not going to process. And, that's part of this training. Like Dave went over, there are certain days for the statutory ones. I think, everybody's pretty good until next year for the most part. And, they're basically just going to sit.
Which is okay, as long as we have a copy of it in our file.
So George, I don't want to take up too much time because I think the most helpful aspect is hearing from Rafael and from David, but there are a couple of things I would point out real quickly so that we can then move on to the rest of the questions. That makes sense?
Sure.
Yep, go.
Sure. So I mean, one is, and I'm making this statement, assuming it's accurate, correct me if I'm wrong, but what is not extended is the time frame to retain an LSRP.
Correct.
That you need to have an LSRP, that time frame exists. That's not what we're talking about. The regulatory timeframes were a creation after the statute. The mandatory timeframes were put into the statute. And to the extent that you could say there was a quid pro quo, and it's not really a quid pro quo, the timeframes and putting in mandatory timeframes was part of the effort to balance having LSRPs be created in the first place when SARA was created in 2009. The mandatory timeframes were the hammer that the department held on to so that the LSRP process would be viewed by the public as something where the environment was still being protected, notwithstanding the competency, tremendous competency of LSRPs. That was what the environmental groups wanted, amongst other things. They certainly didn't support the program generally, but that was the big thing. The mandatory timeframes were there, and that's why there's so much emphasis on these. I would recommend, as I almost always do, that wherever you're going with your timeframes, and I would suggest having a spreadsheet for all your cases if you're an LSRP or if you're a regulated party, same thing, go through and have someone else work on that with you, whether it's counsel, whether it's another LSRP, whether it's someone in-house, definitely go through those and then document that in your files. So if you made an incorrect assumption that you were under the extension, it may not absolve you as the LSRP for failure to notify if that was the requirement, or the responsible party, but it certainly adds color to why you did what you did. And certainly would recommend that. And I don't know, David, if you contemplated the idea, people have submitted notices to the department and to the board that their client might be missing a time frame, but it turns out now they're not going to miss a time frame because they're there. Are you looking for those to be updated, or that's really something you haven't even addressed yet?
Haven't addressed it. And again, I sometimes don't word things politically correctly. You know, that a lot of the purpose of that form is, and I think you were alluding to this, it's a CYA. The CYA goes away because of the extension. You know, you've done, as an LSRP, you've been diligent in letting everybody know, hey, we're getting there, but we're not going to make it on time. You know, mea culpa, please be nice to me. At least I've done this. But now you might make that time, so it's not as relevant.
Right, because I've had questions from clients if in instances where their notice was provided, should that be revoked now? And my suggestion is you could go ahead and submit that. I'm not sure the department's going to be spending a lot of time paying attention to that revocation.
Yeah. Not including George's CYA about the extension request. You know, again, if you want to submit something like that to say, hey, I submitted that, but now I have the extension, so now I think I might make it. But, you know, then we don't want to be in a situation where 10 months from now, it's like, ah, crap, I'm still not going to make it. And now we have a third piece of paper saying, you know, I'm not, I am, I'm not. And,
Right.
you know. But anything from George, we just put in the discard pile. So
Yeah, I understand.
I know there were other questions that were.
Yeah,
posted.
so one that's an interesting one that, you know, I think it's going to be more as an advisement. So a case, you know, with a regulatory time frame or mandatory time frame that falls the day before the EO ends, a 455-day extension will be added on. A case that falls the day after the EO ends, again, we're talking about something down the road.
Mhm.
You know, are you talking yet about how you are going to reconcile that disparity in those cases that had constraints during COVID and now are screwed?
yes, to be honest, when we were first doing this extension, it was going to be 1 year. It wasn't going to be 455 days. And then we bumped up onto the 1 year, and I initiated it. I called DOL. We had a quick conversation, and this was like the 11th hour. We were able to change it to 455. So we would have the breathing room to come up with what are we going to do. Not to say the EO is going to, you know, be pulled tomorrow or anything, but we just needed some breathing room to figure out what do we, at some point we're going to hit the wall of the EO ends and we have a case due tomorrow. So we are working on that. We are going to come out with something. When we met earlier this week, that was, you know, that's a task I'll throw them under the bus again, that we threw over to Rafael and Kevin's shop, you know, to come up with how we're going to implement that policy. You know, what are we going to do for the day after? Because again, we can't say too bad, you're out of luck, your report is due. That would be kind of unfair.
But in the same vein, if I have something coming up in August 1st of this year, and gee, I don't know whether the EO is going to be extended at that point, you know, if we're all being optimistic about vaccination, et cetera,
Mhm.
I should be thinking about getting my extension in request at this point,
Right.
even though the EO might get extended by that point.
Right.
Right.
And we're hoping that we can address that concern in the policy that we develop, and still not put ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden BCANE gets inundated with 1,000 extension requests.
Mhm.
You know, we have to thread that needle of, we don't know when it's ending, but don't panic because we're going to do this for you. You know, can we come up with such a policy?
And what I think is my final point, and really a question, if I have an administrative consent order and it's being extended through this process based on that slide that you showed, that it depends on the type of case it is, correct?
Say that again, Andy, I'm sorry.
So if, let's say I pre-purchase direct oversight ACO. There are a bunch of those out there now where you can go in and, I'm taking over the property. I'm inheriting a time frame that I can't deal with. I negotiate an ACO with DEP.
Mhm.
Fine. That's covered, correct? Those timeframes are covered in here. I don't have to come back and re-amend those.
No,
But if I have an expedited time frame, those are being done on a case-by-case basis. Like anytime I think I'm not going to meet those, I should be discussing that with Kevin's group.
correct.
This is an interesting one. I mean, just to clarify, we've talked all about cases, permits. Does this extension affect permits or biennial certs at all?
No,
Okay, just making sure. Okay. Trying to see if there's something.
So while you're looking for,
Yep.
clearly the extension has its origin with COVID. What if, in fact, as the regulations allow, you have documented that you need an extension because of delays from DEP? Yet, can you add on that request because of delays to DEP to the extension?
again, depending on which time frame you're looking at, and I say it that way on purpose, for the mandatory timeframes, it's explicit in the rule that if it's because you're waiting on a permit from DEP or some other thing from
delays.
DEP, that is quote unquote an automatic on the mandatory.
So I guess my question then is, does that clock start ticking after the extension time period, or is it incorporated in the extension time period?
It's wholly separate.
Yep.
For a mandatory time frame, depending on your case, you get the 455, you get the 1 year, and again, 400. I have to do math. 455 I'll just say minus 400 days from now, 395 days from now, is when you would need to say, hey, you know what, DEP, what's going on? I want an extension to my mandatory because you haven't gotten my permit back to me yet.
Whatever. Right. Thank you.
Yep.
There's a lot of comments and questions relative to the what happens if it's the day after. What happens if it's 2022 and it ends right before that. So I think your response back again is submit your extension request if you are concerned that you're coming up upon it, because if it ends up being the day after 103 is lifted, and I know you said you're still going to talk about this, there's a 60 days for mandatory, 30 days for regulatory, and you blew that time frame already. Is that something you're going to discuss?
Yes, I mean, I'm going way out on the limb because we haven't written the policy yet, but I promise, well, I shouldn't say I promise. My goal would be we're not going to penalize somebody for the governor signing a piece of paper with nobody else knowing that he's getting ready to sign that piece of paper.
Mhm.
He could be signing it right now. I have no idea about that. I sincerely doubt David Haymes, director, am going to be given any kind of heads up he's getting ready to lift the EO. Maybe we will, but it's not like it's going to be 2 months ahead of time. It's going to be that week. I'm not foreseeing a much greater heads up on it than that. And everybody's in the same boat for this. We can't then just turn around and say, oops, too bad. We have to be able to come up with a legally defensible policy that takes into account and gives people some breathing room for the day after. That's my opinion. I'm just a director.
And right now, looking at the worst case scenario, for those that were due March 9th, 2020, and we've given them the 455 days, which puts them at a June 7, 2020 date, or 21 date, sorry. The mandatory timeframe, if it's a mandatory timeframe, you have to submit your extension request by April 8th, 2021, which is around the corner. So that
And
gives
we
you the
want to
60
have,
days.
I'm sorry to cut off Rafael,
Yeah,
and we want to have that policy out
right,
hopefully well before that.
correct, yeah.
To me, well before that might only be a week, but we don't want to be sending that out on April 9th.
Right.
We don't want people scrambling the night of the 8th to work on these things.
Right.
You know, we want them to know what they may have to be because we can't figure out a policy, but we want to have the word out there so everybody knows what's going on with that part of with
Phil, there's
this.
a good question on IECs, which we might want to take.
Well, I guess the only reason I didn't, it says, do IEC annual monitoring and maintenance reports
Right.
qualify for the extension? David said nothing with IEC.
Yeah, and I think that's, yes.
Yeah.
IECs are completely off the table.
George, you have 5 minutes.
I'll clear my throat in 5 minutes. First of all, I do want to say thank you for everybody participating. 187 people are on this call. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sure Rafael works day and night, 24/7, right, Rafael?
Yes, yes, I do.
And I have a
anything
question
you
for
sent
you
to me, I sent to Rafael, so just send it straight to Rafael anyway.
Yeah. Well, and again, just thank you so much. I hope you all who have participated. This is a head turner. I mean, I just, I have a good head for numbers, but I'm still trying to figure this out. And the only way I'm going to do it is through a flow diagram. So many permutations. There's so many individual cases. I feel for the department, quite frankly, because everyone that has these special cases have a right to ask the question how it applies to me. And I don't think DEP is looking to bang anybody. I just think DEP is looking for compliance. And if you think you're doing the right thing, make sure that you're documenting that what you're doing, as Andy has said. And Andy also says every LSRP on a monthly basis ought to review their comprehensive report on data miner. I don't do that, and I think that's really good advice. Phil, I don't have anything else to say. We've got some really good stuff coming up. We have some really interesting chats coming up. We'll keep you all posted on that. We have some really good courses coming up. By the way, let me plug the drone course. We're not getting a lot of response on the drone course. The drone course is fantastic. It really does get down to practical applications of how you can use drones in your environmental assessments, your preliminary assessments, watching remedial activities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Other than that, Phil, I'm good.
Let me, I'm gonna say one more thing. So David and Rafael, again, thank you very much. You know that
Thank
there's
you.
still questions out there, okay? Who is the best person to be reached out to? Email, phone call? What is the best way for people to get questions if they're, and again, the first thing I'd say is, I got out of this thing and I wrote it down, end of April or sometime in April, hopefully data miner is updated. Okay, so I don't think we should ask that question until April rolls around.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody has a question, site specific, who do they go to and what's the best way to contact them in this current world?
I would say that, it's good to be king. Obviously, the easy answer for me is to say contact Rafael. But again, I'm in this up to my eyeballs. I would say, people have my email address off the cover slide. If they want to contact me, I would say contact both of us. Don't just contact me. The more in the weeds in terms of a case-specific issue that it gets, I'm going to rely on Rafael to dig into NGEMS to find answers. Digging into the data mining reports. But I've no problem, staying involved in this. I have to stay involved in this. But, the two of us for sure, the simpler the question, I would say, no, just do the regular, go to the BK duty officer for the day. It may still bubble up to Rafael. It may still bubble up to Kevin. It may still bubble up to me or Kirsten. But, if they can convince themselves it's a simpler question, go to the duty officer. If it's really starting to get convoluted, probably send it to Rafael and me, and then we'll figure out where to take it from there.
And if it involves an NCO, you may want to call compliance assistance. That's the only thing I would suggest.
So one other point besides saying thank you again, we are going to be doing, as I said, these chats. If you have suggestions, anybody in the audience who has a suggestion of a chat that you would like us to figure out whether we should be doing it or not, just send it to me. You all have the CPES email box. Just drop it in and let us know. And as well, if you have a suggestion for courses, we would appreciate it. And for all those people who are on that I know, and by the way, there are a lot of them, including Rick Engel. Oh my God. Hello, Steve Senior and everybody, Labib, Sharon McSweeney. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. And again, thank you again, David and Rafael. And much appreciated.
Thank you.
I did allow everybody to unmute if they'd like to chat amongst themselves. But again, thanks all for joining. And again, this will be posted on our website for perpetuity. And I will make sure the slides are emailed out to anybody who did request it. So thanks again. Great job, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody.
And Ray,
Take care.
great, good seeing you. And sorry you didn't share breakfast with everybody, but
Great show, guys. Thanks.
Hey, Ray. Thanks, Ray.
David, I have a question for you if you're still on.
I'm still here.
If you
Hey,
guys
here
are
we
so, if you guys are, this is my naive, simple, 1,000 feet view question. If the big concern is paper